Our final session for the honors orientation is focused on the book that you read this summer, Bandersnatch. The author of Bandersnatch, Professor Glyer, is one of the professors in the Honors College. She has taught English at APU for many years, and this year she joins the Honors College as a full-time professor in honors alone, and we are blessed to have her with us. She is a well-known scholar on the Inklings and on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. She is a deep lover of Dante. In fact, I believe she's working on a book right now about Dante, and you will enjoy hearing from her as she talks to you about creativity and community. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Glyer.
I've been asked to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects, which is writing. And I have decided that in order to get into that subject, I'm going to do it by talking about my favorite author, who is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a genius. There's no doubt about it. One of the most talented people that you can imagine. But what I want to argue, what I want to try to demonstrate, is that C.S. Lewis accomplished what he did because he made certain choices as an undergraduate and as a new faculty member at Oxford. And it's those deliberate choices that took him from a place of simply being a talented person or a gifted person to being somebody who accomplished all of the things that we associate with the name C.S. Lewis. It's those choices that are available to any of us as we continue on our journey of wanting to be productive and to do work that is significant. Lewis had 3 majors as an undergrad. He was a major in philosophy, in great works, great literature, particularly of the classical period, and also in British or English literature. But despite the fact that he had done extremely well as an undergrad, he had excelled, even won awards for writing as an undergraduate. When he graduated from college, C.S. Lewis had trouble getting a job. Can you imagine? He put ads in the newspaper and did a little bit of tutoring. He pieced together a little bit of this and that to try to help his resume. He did some writing. He did some substitute teaching. And eventually, he got a position as a 1-year appointment at Oxford, which grew into a permanent position as a teacher on the faculty at Magdalen College. When he was in his very, very first year at Oxford, he met another faculty member who was also new to the community. I want you to remember this. For Lewis, this was his very first year and his very first job. And he met another new faculty member, also very young. This faculty member's name was J.R.R. Tolkien. And they were together in the English curriculum. Tolkien was born not in England, but in South Africa. And Tolkien's background was a background both as an artist and a storyteller, but more importantly, his deep love was a love for language, and inventing language and inventing alphabets to go with the languages that he created. When Lewis and Tolkien first met each other, they couldn't stand each other. Their immediate response was antagonism toward one another. And the main reason for that was that the two men were so completely different. They came from very different academic backgrounds. As I said, Lewis was steeped in philosophy and literature, while Tolkien, his academic discipline was linguistics. He loved language structures, grammar, spoke 7 languages at the time and had invented 4. This difference in academic discipline is important because an academic discipline is not just what you study, but how you frame questions and answers to those questions based on the lens that you take. And one of the genius aspects of the Honors College is within your colloquies, you have so many different majors who are represented around the circle. And as Professor Harrington said, that helps us to get a much fuller picture of whatever topic it is that were describing, but because they were so different in their academic orientations, Lewis and Tolkien did not get along. They were also very different in terms of their personalities. So C.S. Lewis, despite the portrayal of Anthony Hopkins in the movie Shadowlands, C.S. Lewis as a person was robust and outspoken. He had a hearty laugh, and he was a man with friends, very outgoing, very connecting. Tolkien, on the other, was a little bit more withdrawn, a little more fragile, a little bit more timid in his personality. So they were on the opposite ends of the scale there. But one of the huge differences between the two men was a difference in their faith traditions. Lewis was Anglican and Tolkien was Catholic. Now that may not seem like a big difference to you, but I want you to remember that C.S. Lewis grew up in Northern Ireland, where battles between Protestants and Catholic rage on to this day in all kinds of different forms, overt and covert. Lewis said that he was trained from the cradle to hate Catholics. So these men did not get off to a very great start because of these very, very deep differences and because of the deep suspicion that they held toward one another. What happened? How did they connect? And how did they become one of the great literary friendships of all time? Well, it happened because of a decision. In this case, a decision that was made by Tolkien. He had an interest in Old Norse mythology. And if you know anything about C.S. Lewis's interests, when he was young, he also was really taken in by what he called northernness, or an interest in Norse mythology, Thor, Loki, that kind of thing. And Tolkien decided that he was going to start a club, group, an informal gathering of friends to get together and to translate 13th and 14th century Icelandic sagas and Eddas from the original Old Norse to modern English. Now, the way this club worked is that they had the Old Norse text in front of them as they would sit in someone's living room. And they would take turns spontaneously translating a portion, and then they would hand that off to the next person and so on around the circle. That's what Old Norse looks like. And one young man who was invited to join the group was caught with notes on his hand and was not, in fact, translating spontaneously, but had prepared his recitation for the group and was kicked out when he was caught cheating. How did Lewis and Tolkien go from being enemies to being friends? How did they transition or change from these hostilities and this suspicion to being two men who enjoyed being together? It was through this club called the Coal Biters. And when the group kind of ran its course and came to the end, Lewis and Tolkien decided that they enjoyed one another's company so much that they wanted to continue to meet together. In one of the last books that C.S. Lewis wrote in his life, a book called The Four Loves, Lewis said that lovers spend their energies looking at one another, but friends stand side by side, looking in the same direction together, and that's the forge of friendship. So their friendship was forged in the act of together looking at the same texts, of hammering out what they said and what they meant. And they wanted to continue after that just to keep the conversation going. So they made a simple decision. Hey, how about we get together for lunch 1 day a week? Simple, easy, incredibly powerful and transforming for both men, because they met at the Eastgate Hotel. They sat down, they had their lunch, they talked about everything that concerned them. As new faculty members, they talked about school politics and how things work in the environment that they both found themselves in. They talked about the books that they were reading and the struggles that they were having. And their friendship went deeper still. C.S. Lewis called these Monday meetings the brightest spot of his week. Remember, they went from enemies to friends and then went even deeper in their friendship as they shared meals together, made time and space for one another, held space for the things that were of concern to the other. One small group to one dyad that had powerful implications. Because at one of those meetings, after lunch, I want you to imagine they've been sitting here, they've sort of finished up. It's raining outside because it's Oxford and it's raining. And as Tolkien grabs his coat and he puts it on and he gets ready to head out the door, he realizes that he has put a manuscript in his pocket, as was his habit. Whatever it was he was working on, he tended to roll up and put into the pocket of his raincoat. And he turns back to Lewis, who's still also getting his things together. And Tolkien, remember, very shy. Tolkien stuttered, very, very much the classic introvert. Tolkien turns back, and I can only imagine, with a tremble in his voice and his classic stutter, says something like, Jack, I've been working on a poem. I've been writing. I've been writing a poem. Would you like to read it? That act of incredible courage on Tolkien's part changed everything. Lewis took that manuscript home and read it eagerly. The next day, he sent Tolkien a note, very, very short, only fills half a piece of paper. And he said that it has been a long time since I had an evening of such delight. I would have loved this poem had I found it by accident in a bookshop by an unknown author. That poem, by the way, was the Lay of Lathian, which you may know by its more recent title, The Story of Beren and Lucian, which was just published this last year for the very first time. The story of Beren and Lucian is a story of an elf maiden and a mortal named Beren, of their romance and the challenges that relationship faced. This poem is key to Tolkien's Silmarillion, but more importantly, it's key to Tolkien's own story because the characters, Beren and Lucian, are modeled over the romance of Tolkien with his dear wife, Edith. In fact, when you have the privilege of going to Oxford, you can visit their graves. And on the gravestones, it says, Beren and Lucian, John Ronald Tolkien and Edith Tolkien. This story was not only key to the stories that Tolkien had to tell, it was key in terms of his own mythology, his own ability to mythologize the things that he personally had studied. I point that out because the process of sharing our writing with one another feels scary. We feel exposed, timid, reluctant. But because of that courageous step that Tolkien took to share his manuscript with his friend, all kinds of things started to open up for both of them. Lewis wrote this wonderful note of encouragement at the end of that experience, but there was a P.S. on that note. And the P.S. said, criticisms, comma, including quibbles about individual lines, comma, shall follow, period. Well, that list of quibbles, critique, was 14 pages single-spaced, of recommendations, rewrites, edits, suggestions. But here's the thing. Which of the two notes do you think that Tolkien prized the most? The short letter of unabashed praise or the long, detailed exposition of ways that his work could improve? Tolkien appreciated both of them. Both are important. But what really moved him deeply was the second. And the reason for that is he had found someone who could function as a resonator, somebody who believed in the work he was doing, somebody who cared enough to lavish attention on something that was very, very important to him, someone who helped him to discover that what he thought was private actually had much to say to a much wider audience than he ever anticipated. Tolkien said that at that time in his life, he considered his own work merely his own private hobby. And he was more astonished than anyone that there might be others who are interested in what he had to say. Do you see it? As we take risks to invite one another into that process, we find other people who are committed to helping to bring out the best of what we have to say. And that's what happened next. Because these Mondays got more complicated in the best sense of the word. Lewis not only wrote 2 letters of critique of the Lay of Lathian, he also returned the favor and gave Tolkien some of the poetry that he had been writing. Isn't that cool? And that Monday time went from being just a sort of free-for-all lunchtime conversation to being an incredible work session where they got together, they ate their lunch, but they also read and shared the things that they were working on. Over time, this sharing of manuscripts, of sharing very rough drafts with each other, became so important to both men that they started inviting other friends into the group. And ultimately, as you know from your reading this summer, the Inklings grew to a total of about 19 men, but generally only 4, 5, or 6 of them would show up on a weekly basis, mostly on Thursday nights. They were late people. They would start working about 9 p.m. and they would finish about 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning. And they did this faithfully every week for almost 17 years. Isn't that cool? They didn't have any teachers telling them they had to do it. They didn't have any structure that they were inheriting. They said, this is of such incredible value to the work that God is calling me to do that I'm going to continue to invest in this small circle. One of the things I love to emphasize about the meetings of the Inklings is that what they shared with one another were manuscripts that were so fresh that the ink wasn't even dry yet. As they read their stories together, as Lord of the Rings was read chapter by chapter as it was written, Tolkien had just finished it and then rolled up that new chapter and ran off to an Inklings meeting. These were their most raw, most fresh drafts, because when drafts are fresh and raw and unfinished, the feedback of others has the most power to make a difference. And it's in that setting that their work continued to get better and better and better. If you compare the Silmarillion, which some of you have tried to read, with the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit, you see the difference that audience makes. You see the difference between something that you're writing for your own reflection and something that you're writing for a wider audience. The other thing that is so cool about what the Inklings did is they spent a lot of time not just reading and critiquing, but talking about the substance of the ideas that they were writing about, clarifying what they thought. And so I always picture them leaving that living room, walking home in the rain, and thinking to themselves, yeah, I don't think that was right, but I think that Toller's made a good point, and I love Charles's insight into that, and I can't wait to incorporate that into the next draft or the next chapter. As a scholar who has spent an entire lifetime looking at these manuscripts, so much of the evidence of the influence of the Inklings is invisible. Because as Tolkien would bring a chapter of The Lord of the Rings and read it to the group would not only talk about what he had read, but make suggestions for what he might write next. So the ins and outs and the direction of the story were shaped as the group itself said, I want to hear more about this, or I want to know more about that, or don't have so much dialogue, or pick up the pace a little bit, or whatever it was. We don't have a lot of those notes. Wouldn't it be cool to have better records of what they said and what difference it made? But can you see the importance of anticipation to the development of these works? Did it make a difference ultimately? Is there any way to quantify it? Well, there's one way we can look at it that gives us a clue. When Lewis started with the Inklings, his claim to fame were these two books, which I'm sure you're very well acquainted with. These are both books of poetry, because when Lewis started, he thought that his contribution as an author primarily would be to become one of the world's greatest poets. So he published 2 volumes of poetry, neither of which anyone reads except for really serious and depressed scholars. Dimer, I mean, seriously. So this is his claim to fame after the Inklings. The Inklings had a hand in all of those works. Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, That Hideous Strength. Chronicles of Narnia was a mixed bag, as you know. Tolkien didn't like it at all, but some other members of the group did and carried it through. But these are some of the works that came that were created in the forge of the conversation among the group. Well, how about Tolkien, our introverted member of the group? When he started, his claim to fame was, in fact, a glossary. We don't today think of Tolkien as being famous for his glossary. He had written a lot of the background, what's called the legendarium, right, behind the Lord of the Rings stories. But he wasn't by nature interested in story. In fact, he said that he wouldn't have written stories if it hadn't been for C.S. Lewis. In one interview, Tolkien said, "You know, Jack, he always had to have a story." So the idea, even the idea of writing a story about this world that Tolkien had created was something that was externally motivated. And all of these works and more were created within that particular circle. So the question for us, especially as we think about the curriculum of the Honors College, the writing that you're going to do, since we don't have exams and we don't have quizzes, there's so much weight on you becoming great at the writing that you do. Well, if we can figure out how the Inklings did what they did, we can learn from that. And as you saw in Bandersnatch, there are different kinds of categories of help and support that occur in a healthy writing group, a healthy rhetoric group, a healthy colloquy group, as we try more and more to continually bring out the best in each other. There's encouragement, there's challenge, there's advice, and there are joint projects, each one a little different. As we encourage one another, we say to the author, "You got this." But we also provide accountability, right? Don't we thrive when there are deadlines? Yes? All of us do. I think that Tolkien did particularly. I do believe that all of The Lord of the Rings was written on Wednesday night because Inklings met on Thursdays, but I can't actually technically prove that. I don't like the word accountability, though. The word I like better is the word expectation. Think about your writing for your writing group, your writing even for your professors, being met with eager expectation. What is it I will learn from you? How will my thinking be enriched by you? How will you shine brighter than you have before as a communicator in the work that you're doing? How can we provide an atmosphere, a culture of eager expectation to bring out the best in one another? Challenge is important too, because what challenge does is one of two things. Challenge either helps us to avoid dead ends when people say, whoa, wait a minute, I think you're off track here. But sometimes when a person says, I think you're off track here, like my mentor did when I started studying the Inklings, when he took me aside and he said, don't research these guys. You'll never get to the bottom of them. You'll never find what you're looking for. That was challenge. That was somebody says, don't do this. This isn't working. And I am so grateful for my mentor who warned me. Because at that moment I had to decide, am I serious about this? Do I really want it? Am I hungry for it? Am I committed to it? And that challenge helped me, especially as a young scholar, to realize that this wasn't going to be easy and it wasn't going to be tidy. It's a messy process to do research sometimes. Lots of stuff going on, lots of things to juggle, and opposition all over the place, as well as misunderstanding and other kinds of problems. But I was prepared for it because somebody cared enough to go, whoa, are you sure you know what you're doing? And so that opposition for me was a great gift. Not because I gave it up at that time, because I didn't. What I did is I dug down deep and I said, no, I have to do this. I can't not do this. And I will not be daunted as I go on. So challenge is different from encouragement or praise. We need both of those, but we also sometimes just need advice. As you're giving advice to people, the formulation for that I think works best is just to say, try this instead. This looks good, but try this. You could try this. A lot of times when we give each other feedback or critique, what we do is diagnose. We say, this is boring, or this goes on too long. Instead of giving prescription, try adding more interest. Try compressing this part. Our revisions and our writing improve faster when, as advice givers, we're very specific about things we could try. Because a lot of times, let's admit it, I know it's boring, but if I knew how to make it not boring, I'd have made it not boring, right? And so it's not helpful for me because I usually kind of know that. But what I don't know is, what do I do to fix it? Try this. Make global suggestions about the larger issues. Avoid the temptation to get lost in the details. Think about the big picture of what the person is trying to accomplish. And sometimes we can share solutions that come from our own experience. One of the things that the Inklings did from time to time is they took on joint projects. So a joint project is when you sit down and you say, all right, how about we do this thing? How about we make a movie? How about we write a song? How about we do this? And you follow through all the way to the conclusion of it. You will have opportunities to do that throughout your 4 years, but your senior year particularly is a wonderful opportunity for you to work collaboratively with a small group of other students to produce something really, really magnificent. And again, what I want to point out about this idea of joint projects is that the best groups have a diversity of talents, a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of academic disciplines and personalities, and perhaps even faith traditions. And we aren't successful in spite of those differences. Strong groups are successful because of those differences. So I promised you some advice. Advice from Lucian Tolkien is that we need to get better as we learn to encourage, challenge, advise, and work together. And throughout the writing program, you'll have lots of opportunities to do that. As you read, as you discuss, as you form informal groups, like the Coal Biters, maybe not to translate Old Norse sagas, but maybe to figure out what it is that one author or another is trying to communicate. Ad hoc groups, study groups, lunch groups. Groups need to be an intentional part of your life as a scholar, because once you get used to that rhythm, it will pay off big time in the long run, because we really are better together in so many ways. I'm going to give you one last piece of advice, and this advice comes from Frodo and Sam. You've seen the Lord of the Rings movie, right? You know the basic idea, that Frodo has taken on the challenge of taking the one ring to Mount Doom so that it can be destroyed. His faithful friend in that journey is Sam. It's interesting to me, by the way, that both Lewis and Tolkien talk so much about fellowships, of groups that are made up of different kinds of people, right? Whether that's the 4 children in Narnia or the entire Fellowship of the Ring, the representation from a broad range of perspectives is what makes the fellowship so powerful. And those forces that seek to split or divide the fellowship are the ones that must be resisted at all costs. Well, I love Lord of the Rings, obviously, as a story in so many ways. But one of the passages from the book that is so moving comes toward the end of Frodo and Sam's journey, as Frodo has basically given everything he's got and just can hardly move forward anymore. And Sam is watching this, and his heart is broken as he watches his master suffer in this way. And here's what happens. Here we are. Now for the last gasp, said Sam, struggling to his feet. He bent over Frodo, waking him gently. Frodo groaned, but with great effort of will, he staggered up, and then he fell upon his knees again. He raised his eyes with difficulty to the dark slopes of Mount Doom, towering above him, and then, pitifully, he began to crawl forward on his hands. Sam looked at him and wept in his heart, but no tears came to his dry and stinging eyes. I said I'd carry him if it broke my back, he muttered, and I will. Come, Mr. Frodo, he cried. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. So up you get. Come on, Mr. Frodo. Sam will give you a ride. Just tell him where to go, and he'll go. As Frodo clung upon his back, arms loosely about his neck, legs clasped firmly under his arms, Sam staggered to his feet. And then, to his amazement, he felt the burden light. He had feared that he would have barely strength to lift his master alone. And beyond that, he had expected to share in the dreadful, dragging weight of the accursed ring. But it was not so. Whether because Frodo was so worn by his long pains, wound of knife, venomous sting, and sorrow, fear, and homeless wandering, or whether because some gift of final strength had been given to him, Sam lifted Frodo with no more difficulty than if he were carrying a hobbit child piggyback in some romp on the lawns or hayfields of the Shire. He took a deep breath and started off. It's a deeply spiritual principle, isn't it? To bear one another's burdens, to do all we can to love and serve one another. And the happy result is that when we do, we find our burdens, our homework, our reading, our writing, so much easier as the burden is shared around and among us. We'll be continuing to unpack how that happens in more practical detail, starting on Wednesday with our lecture, where I'll go into more depth and more complexity about the whole process of writing groups. And I can't wait to continue our conversation in that setting. Thank you.